I have to get the magic tennis racket, which zaps them, because otherwise it's going to fly around my head. Hang on.
So, Paolo, which part of the world are you sat in your car in?
I am near Glastonbury, of all places.
Okay, I'm back. No, I haven't got with the fly. Sorry, guys.
Well, if you haven't already figured it out, we're doing things a little bit differently for our 100th episode. This is Matthew Grant, partner at InsTech London, host of the InsTech London podcast, and this week joined by my fellow partners, Robin Merttens and Paolo Cuomo. So it is rather ironic that I received an email today that goes as follows. Matthew, a quick note to say how much I'm enjoying your podcast. In many podcasts, the host thinks it's about them, but the InsTech podcasts stay fresh and interesting. Well, Alex, I do hope you'll excuse us for this, our 100th episode, that we decided to make it, well, about us. But if this is your first InsTech London podcast, then I promise I do normally make my fascinating guests this focus of attention. So please do check out the other 99, or at least some of them. And of course, not just all these podcasts, but none of the events that we run, all the advisory work we do would have been possible without our incredible community and network from across the world, incidentally, not just London. Maybe it's time to rebrand. Anyway, a huge thanks to all of you that have supported us for your time, money, or just spreading the good word. Now, Robin and Paolo co-founded InsTech London 5 years ago. I found them a year later. More about that in a minute. And Paolo's got a real job these days, so whilst you may not be hearing as much from him, we did manage to grab him so we could have the chance to record this together, albeit remote and digital. So here we go, freshly recorded last week. Now, we were rather missing the exposed bricks and concrete of the Steelyard, where we've been running our live events up until February. So we've brought this episode to you in a slightly more raw and unpolished form than our usual episodes. We think it works though, but you will need to supply your own wine. Paolo, Robin, it's been a while since we got together. We seem to have been doing quite well on previous podcasts. In fact, we kind of don't disclose our own rating figures, but feedback I've had is people would actually like to hear from us again. So what better way to celebrate the 100th podcast and to have some self-indulgence as we talk to you, but hopefully along the way we'll actually generate some useful insights for our listeners.
Well, thanks for having us at our own podcast.
And Robin, we're recording this at 1 o'clock. I think you had some lunch, because a sort of hungry, grumpy Robin Merttens is going to be tricky to handle on a Friday.
No indulgence or self-indulgence this end so far, but being a Friday, it's only a matter of time.
Good. Okay, so both of you were there right from the beginning. What stimulated you to kick off InsTech London in the first place?
Well, really, Paolo and I copied what was going on in fintech. We could see how exciting all that scene was. There were no insurance versions of it. Paolo said to me, there's only one way to find out whether this will work, and that's to create one. And that night, he pinged me a meetup group invite, having created an InsTech London meetup group. And within a year, I think we had 2,000 meetup members, and suddenly there was an obligation on Paolo and I to do something and to run something, and it sort of crept up on us like that.
I just realised I never actually asked how the two of you met. What was the happy story, but who met the other one first, if that's possible?
I remember this because it was one of the first times I sat on a stage talking about technology and insurance. Robin and I were paired together despite not knowing each other, needing to make the case for why the insurance industry was behind the curve in its use of technology. And we both did such a good job of pointing out why really insurance should stop being such a laggard, that it was sort of love at first sight. And from there, our desire to see the industry do a better job around technology has just kept us together.
It could have gone so badly wrong as well, just knowing we've all got strong views. Well, it's great that you both gave birth to InsTech London. And Paolo, can you remember who was there at that first event and what's happened to them?
Well, the first pitch event, I think, is the one that was most memorable because it went beyond just chats over beer and stuff. And a couple jump out, two names that people will know. One is Phoebe Hughes from Brolly spoke, and Phoebe was fascinating because she didn't realise she was going to do that. She was cajoled into doing it by some of the people who came along, and she very eloquently explained what her plans for Brolly were. Someone else who spoke was Freddie McNamara, who people may not know Freddie's name so well, but they'll know his company Cover, which does by the hour car insurance, or started doing that, now does various other things. Cover just raised £15 million at the end of last year. And so, an indication that some of these ideas have, really gone on to have an impact.
Matthew, I put 500 quid behind the bar that night, and I'm not sure I've ever claimed it back. So we might have a conversation about that later.
Or maybe you could also have got some equity at the same time.
Maybe.
Good. And then who else was there? Because we've had, one of our successes has been this sort of pay forward model where we bring people in, and we still do today as startups, look after them, give them a free drink. And many of them have rewarded us by coming full members a couple of years later. But of the sort of big names that are out there just now, is there anybody else that we can take credit for of launching their careers, even if we were only a part of it?
One has to be very careful overestimating the impact one has had, but there are a whole bunch of people who've been on the journey with us. I mean, this is now 2015 we're talking about, and it was the birth of insurtech. I mean, we're called InsTech because the word insurtech didn't exist, and we were all sort of wondering what the name would be. But in that era, Cytora, Consiris, Flock, Trove, all emerged, and they're all very successful businesses these days. And our supporters from beginning to end, AXA, originally in its Catlin form, Munich Re Digital Partners, Polar Capital. They're people who were there at the start, and they were very good at providing what I call civic responsibility. Putting some money in the pot to enable us to kind of ferment this a bit, and ideally, and I think palpably, provide something of benefit to the whole community.
Yeah, I'm just sensing we've got a potential future event of This Is Your Life if we dig out some of those early videos and recordings of when they were doing their original pitch, and to see how close their business model is today. And no harm in doing a pivot, but I'm sure we get a bit of a laugh, as everyone would, out of some of those early stories. And who knows, there might be some ideas still out there that we haven't yet, or nobody has yet developed, and we could find some new opportunities for startups.
It's a very interesting point, Matthew, because of course what happens is when you're living in the moment, you're not taking detailed notes. You're not listing everyone who went to every event or anything, because you think you're not going to forget. And one sits here 5 or 6 years later, and luckily, one of the things that we did, not with a view to creating an archive, but merely with the view to getting the social media going, was that we did film and record and things. And there's an awful lot of handheld movie footage of those early presentations, which, as you say, could bring some really rather interesting insight into how things have developed as and when someone wants to do the history of insurtech.
Yeah, and that's actually also how I got to know Robert. I've known you for a while, but it kind of came across InsTech London. Was I thought that was a great opportunity to go and sit in there, write up what people have talked about, and then sound informed and intelligent, and put it out on LinkedIn. And actually, it generated a lot of interest for me on that. And then I think we sort of figured out we should do something together on the back of it.
No, well, thank God you came along. I mean, I'm not sure we don't still sort of do that to some degree or another, but there weren't many people out there. Paolo, I don't say he abandoned me, but he got a much safer way of earning money than running a community. So you coming along was a blessing in disguise. And there weren't many people who are sort of proven insurance professionals who've been around the block who were interested in this stuff then. So it was marvelous that you and I could find a way of getting together. And frankly, you turned what was a hobby for me, something I sort of enjoyed, and occasionally some business built out of it, into a business. So thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I guess people use various metrics to define success. If we did a quality of wine served at InsTech London events over the last 5 years, that'd be quite a good index to justify or demonstrate the success we've had and be able to invest some money back into the business. And maybe there's even a parametric insurance index on quality of wine served at events as a definition of whether the events company is actually doing well or going to go out of business. But anyway, I guess that's another time.
Well, from my point of view, I still can't drink the wine we serve up. I have to have my own special bottle. So although it's getting better, it's still not good enough. But that's something we can work on in 2020.
Well, I mean, that does come to our business model, doesn't it? I mean, we have intentionally kept the costs pretty low and rely heavily, and thank you to all of you listening who have supported on this, so that we can bring people in pretty early. Hopefully everybody gets more than the pure value of what they're paying for this. But it has meant we've been able to grow the business pretty quickly, but we've also been able to fund it. And I guess there's a balance, isn't there, to how good the quality of the refreshments are and how much we ask people to pay, and therefore limit what we can actually do. And also importantly, that we haven't talked really about how the community works and the network works, but it's very important for all of us. So we really have people in here that we, frankly respect, like the idea, and think are going somewhere, as they just chase after the next check.
Matthew, I think it's worth just touching again on that point of individuals. We've mentioned some of the companies that we've seen grow. There's I don't want to go into names, but they know who they are. Those people who are happy to believe where we were going, who were happy to stand up on stage, to step in for a speaker who'd pulled out at the last minute, who were encouraging their colleagues to come along, even if their colleagues may still have been skeptical. And as with any community, the value to the whole community, I think, comes from the sort of the hard work and the belief of a core 10 or 20%. And so, thank you to those who've believed in us over the last few years.
As a consequence of that, the truth is we've helped so many people. I mean, I don't say that to brag, but I think it's to highlight the power of a community. The number of people who have met a source of capacity, a potential investor, recruited as a result of our activities, both physical and in terms of our digital output, is immense. And dear Trove always say to me, they were a very early supporter of ours, back in our day of our very first show and tell. That's where they met Munich Re Digital Partners, and Munich Re Digital Partners and Trove have gone on to do great things, and they undoubtedly would have met anyway. But those sort of networking, those sort of connections come, from the fact there's a community. Some we know about, but a huge majority of it that we just don't know about, and we do love to know about them. And if anyone's got them, let us know. But that there's just a kind of power to being able to create a community that enables everyone to benefit from it.
Yeah, and that power actually has given us some momentum over the last few months, when obviously we couldn't all be jammed into the steel yard, packed together. But it does seem to have continued, doesn't it? And we all perhaps have to work a little bit harder to make the introductions to people and make sure that the people we're going to introduce are going to find a receptive audience. But it's going to be an intriguing question generally in this whole space, as to how that personal contact flourishes, and that particularly that kind of sort of ad hoc personal contact. I mean, social distancing and return to work is okay up to a point, but you kind of really need to have the volume of people. I mean, it's partly like any event or any party. You're never going to be able to have a good conversation with everybody, but I've got this view that there's sort of rule of three of any kind of event. 1/3 of the people there really don't want to talk to you. 1/3, frankly, you probably decide you haven't got anything in common and don't want to talk to them. And 1/3 of the people you want to talk to. And you kind of need a bit of volume and an excuse to go and talk to people to do that. Anyway, it's going to be a challenge going forward, but I think we're going to be getting back to some kind of event soon, aren't we, Robin?
I want to be first out the traps. I'm glad that we're no longer known by some people as just a sort of, place to go drinking on a Monday night at the steel yard. The fact that we have so much support and continuing to sign members regularly shows that people understand our true value. And if we've lost a few people who just use it for a glass of wine and browbeating people, then that's fine by me. We need those physical events back, both in steel yard type things, but dinners and round tables and stuff. That's crucial work for us.
So Paolo, Rob and I know what we're up to, but I don't think everybody does. We've managed to find some professional help to do the very vital work of proofreading the newsletter. So we've let you off that task. But for those who aren't familiar with what you're up to, probably worth a few words about your current activities.
So I'm currently Director of Operations at Insurance. Britain's a fascinating place to be. It has the advantage of being large enough to invest in real innovation, and many people will be aware of the Key Syndicate, which is a fully digital, algorithmically driven follow syndicate we've just launched with working with Google. But it's also small enough that projects like that could just happen. You pull together the right team and you just get things done. So I'm absolutely loving being able to take some of those early thoughts from my InsTech London days, a lot of the theory and PowerPoint that I wrote whilst being a consultant, and bring it all together to actually drive proper digital change within insurance. So feeling very honoured to be able to do that, and very much enjoying it. Some people are aware that I'm also dabbling in quantum technology, and I, showing an entire lack of originality, have set up a meetup group called Quantum London, which in many ways is trying to replicate what we did with InsTech London those 5 or 6 years ago. And it's very interesting to compare and contrast. There is absolutely that same hunger for information, for connections, for discussions as we saw in the early days of insurtech when we set InsTech up. What's far harder, and this is ignoring sort of the whole COVID side of things, what's far harder is that the creation of a community needs to, as you've just said, be people building off each other. And the quantum space is actually too large. You've got real technologists, you've got people who want to invest, you've got people who are just petrified about security implications. And so I think it's going to be very hard to replicate the success that InsTech London has had in building the community.
I hope we don't lose you totally, but I guess one word of advice, just given the experience you've had with InsTech London, is becoming more and more global now, and maybe if it's not too late, you might want to rebrand yourself as Quantum Global, just to allow you to grow into that space in the future. But yeah, hopefully we're still going to see some more of you when we get back together again, and you still play a vital role in the background. And actually, mentioning the Key Syndicate that you're doing, of course, the best performing podcast just now is the interview with Mark Allen and James Birch about that Key Syndicate. So I guess you win either way. If this one ends up being very popular, you still Brit get a look in, which is great.
And I pick up on that, Paolo, your quantum thing, because I don't know if you remember, I'm sure you do, but we did exactly the same thing with blockchain. I mean, somebody came to us and said, if you're talking about the future of insurance, you need to do something on blockchain. What is blockchain? I said, I had no idea what it was. This was certainly 2015. And you and I got 20 people around the table and we started talking about blockchain. And that, first of all, it was about understanding what it was. And if I'm entirely honest, I don't think I ever believed in it. But it is the sort of thing you have to bring to the community, and you have to showcase what's going on, and that's your role. And suddenly in 2018, 19, people couldn't talk about anything else. And now the enthusiasm has died away. On a similar note, we had events around peer-to-peer. Do you remember peer-to-peer?
Indeed, peer-to-peer was going to change the world. I think all the peer-to-peer startup insurers were telling all the incumbents that they had no chance.
I mean, LACA's done a great job. Well done them. But it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed the world. These are funny things. But telematics in 2015 was just emerging. I mean, it was the era in which you had to pay 400 quid for a black box and put it in the car, and people were going to say it's just going to change everything. And that really has changed everything. And we all believe, I think, that IoT and the ability to kind of dynamically find out who's doing what, to assess and manage risk is going to be, is almost indisputably a key part of the future of insurance. But, some of these things work, some of them don't. But the job of I think of InsTech London is to put them up there and let people make their own minds up.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these things, they need a bit of oxygen, and blockchain is a classic example of sort of technology looking for a solution. And I mean, it's hardly mentioned today. And in fact, it's almost a signal that if there's a startup saying they're going to do things on blockchain, they might have kind of missed the boat a bit. Distributed ledger has still got a role to play. But I think, it's important to actually bring that together, get some people, and sometimes these things work, sometimes they don't, and we're all wiser. So you mentioned peer-to-peer, but what else, Robin, do you look back on 2015, do you sort of think about, for better or worse, as being themes that have either developed or disappeared 5 years later?
I mean, my overarching feel of it is that it all felt in 2015 very disruptive. Part of that peer-to-peer there were plenty of others, were going. The narrative was, you're all hopeless insurance. You don't know what you're talking about. We kids are going to come and change the world. Look at what we know. We understand the customers and you don't. Type of narrative. I do remember that company. Was it Guevara? I think they were doing motor insurance. They were the most outspoken of the lot, and duly departed 3 years later, and haven't been much missed, I don't think. But it was very quickly, it took a couple of years probably into this sort of narrative, the narrative changing of the understanding that insurance was much more difficult to disrupt than anything else, than anybody expected, and that we've now come into this sort of partnerships phase, which I think dilutes the possibilities, but it has enabled a lot more to happen than this sort of conflict dominated the really early years.
You may recall, Robin, of course, that every blog post back then, I think we still called them blogs then, was dominated by a picture of an asteroid crashing in and killing the dinosaurs, because that was very much, as you say, the sort of confrontational mindset. And it created a wonderful energy. I think that, everyone was up for it. In those days, the incumbent insurers couldn't even get a website working, frankly. So no one was feeling sorry for them when the sort of tech startups came along. But as you say, that had to rapidly change. And, there's a whole other podcast to be done on the intrinsic challenges of, building a startup in a heavily regulated space, etc. But it was good to see that change. But if we hadn't had the aggressive dynamic energy to start with, this may all have been a little different.
I think it's a good point. Matthew, you were around that whole 5 years. I mean, what would be your assessment of what's come and gone in the 5 years?
Well, I keep going back to this one, but because I just kind of find it both amusing and sort of relevant to what we're talking about. I mean, pet insurance, which people dismissed 5 years ago, apart from bought by many, and even they were actually much broader in what they were offering, is now one of the areas that people are focusing on, because pet insurance is the premium, something like 25% of motor insurance. People are spending more money on pets, but we could have figured that out a few years ago. I think, to me, what's actually where the real area of interest is, and still massive potential for everyone, is this whole area, both of the protection gap, things that can't be insured. I was just developing a report just now on parametric insurance, and 96% of economic losses in the developing world are not insured, and something like 60% in the developed world. And the reality is they're not insured because they're just too difficult to be able to quantify. And so, there's plenty of capital out there. There's lots of people finding ways to use data. If we can't reduce that percentage over the next decade, then frankly, we should always go back to the old way of doing things. So it's not easy. I mean, the reality is the tough problems to solve are not easy, and they need experimentation, and they actually need quite a lot of capital as well. But I do think that's going to be one area to look at. I mean, within that, we did this event with Lloyd's when they released their intangible assets. That's all part of that. The sort of, everyone's heard the stats, about 80% of the world is moving to intangible, really hard to insure. But even if you look back 5 years ago, cyber, I think Allianz claimed that there'd be $20 billion of cyber premium income by 2020. We're nowhere near that. And actually, the reason is that human nature being what it is, until you have a massive loss, people tend not to focus on it too much, and it grows, but grows slowly. So, I was encouraged 5 years ago by the recognition that data was important. Having been doing catastrophe modeling for 25 years before that, which all relied really heavily on data, it was good to know people finally woke up for it. But again, the challenge with data is you've got to actually really believe in it. It has to be actionable. It can't just tell you something that you can't do anything with. So I think the future is also disruption. If you look at who's been the true disruptors, well, it's probably Lemonade, not really because of the business model, because frankly, I think that's really not what makes a difference. It's just they've invested very heavily in marketing. If you spend $100 million on marketing, then you're going to disrupt the industry to some extent. So that's, I think, another challenge is, to what extent are you disrupting with technology versus you kind of buy your way in there to be disruptive.
Yeah, Matthew, to your point about the protection gap, in some ways that's almost one of my sadnesses over the last 5 years, that the hope of being able to reduce that for so many people in so many ways has not necessarily come to pass, because clearly insurance can be so valuable for people when they need it. There's definitely some really quite, I think, quite heartwarming exceptions. And if you look, for example, at what Cover's done with pay by the hour car insurance, or what Zego's done in terms of the gig economy, what they have done is they have enabled people to actually live better, so to speak, as a result. And where startups are able to not just be successful and embrace technology better, but also allow their customers to be better off as a result, I think we should be celebrating those successes.
We should. And actually, we're doing an event, quick advertisement for anybody that would like to sponsor or be on stage. Sponsorship helps, guarantee you get on stage, by the way. We're doing an event of uninsured but not uninsurable for things like Paolo, the kind of things you mentioned, or anybody else that's found they've got something they want to insure or want to build a business around it. But I think it is that challenge of scale, frankly. I mean, the trouble with not the trouble, but the reality of the insurance market is if you can't generate revenues exceeding $10 million if you're an MGA, because your capacity provider is going to want to get a big chunk of that, then it's really hard to get anybody interested because it's just the cost don't make sense. And it's partly why Trove switched their business model from having insurance for device insurance to essentially becoming a white label platform, because the cost of acquisition was so high. And so I think it's a warning for everybody that if an organization like Trove, who we've got a lot of respect for, did a really good job, if they can't scale it, I think back to his protection gap piece, it does actually need investment. And it's like Global Parametrics, who we're doing an event with on the 1st of October. I've got government support for doing that. It needs that to really be able to make a difference. It's just very, very difficult for that area to grow organically.
Is that why you can't get insurance for your tractor?
Good news is I now have insurance for
my
tractor, but only third-party liability. So if anybody nicks it, I'm down my tractor. But
I can't see that happening anytime soon, frankly. Anyway.
Well, at the speed it goes, I think I could run up and catch them. But Paolo, let's just quickly switch to let's talk about the podcast, and then we should probably wrap up fairly soon. But when you kicked this back off a couple of years ago, podcasts have sort of had an interesting resurgence in the last few years. But what was your original thinking behind doing this? Because you've got a lot going on.
Absolutely, and I think to some extent, this plays to our earlier point around how we started sort of very bootstrappy, very, very rough and ready. Because unlike the effort that goes into podcasts these days, including, of course, this one that you're doing now, Matthew, it was a phone held to the speaker's mouth and a few questions just thrown at him or her, and then we pressed upload. Now, why did we do it? I think partly it was expediency, which is it's actually as you will well know, it's hard to write good quality long form prose. People may read a 1,000-word article in a few minutes, but it takes an awful long time to write that, whilst just recording someone speaking is far easier. The other sense, I think, is because there was a real thirst for ideas, for opinions back when we started doing it, it's easier to get people to be open and honest on a podcast than if you're then asking if you can quote them in written word. So the ability to get someone to really say what they thought and then share that with our admittedly much smaller audience then was very efficient. And what I love about what you're achieving still with the podcast, Matthew, is that you're still getting people to be open and honest in a way that it may be harder to do if you were writing down what they were saying. In terms of, it'd be interesting to know your view of why you feel that it is still working as a medium. We had no strategy, to Robin's point, when we started it up. You've turned it into something incredibly successful. What's your sense of why people are still tuning in?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. I think podcast generally is the kind of intimacy of podcasts. So at the moment, someone's got us plugged into their ears or maybe on the speakerphone, probably doing something else at the time. But it's just a very different dynamic that happens then, and you can get away with a slightly different discussion. And I think people are hungry for content. And for me, the reason I enjoy doing it is I'm curious. And so for us, we're pretty careful who we have as guests, because we want to have people that, frankly, the joy of running your own business is you can choose who you do things with. And all the guests we've had I found really fascinating. And so I think that's one part of it. I mean, the other part is, you touched on earlier on, but there is this real thirst for content. And so for an organization that wants to get its word out, it's a really efficient way of doing that is to have a half an hour interview with us. We turn that into a a written bit of material, they can post a podcast on their website, and suddenly they go from not really having an effective way to tell their story to something that they can distribute through multi-channels and through very little work on their end. It's just, it's just proved incredibly efficient. And so, and we're always welcoming more guests. Robin, you were not really a big fan of podcasts. You were probably more of a Radio 4 listener, were you, back a couple of years ago?
Special, yeah. I've got to be quite honest with this. You guys was banging on about podcasts, and I was going, yeah, well, whatever. And now, if I talk to anyone about, and I work for InsTech London, they all go, well, we listen to your podcast. They're the best insurtech podcast. So it's great from my point of view. We're no better for our podcast than we are for any sort of event we hold in London or anything else. And that's one, a sign of the times, and two, how palpably wrong I was in thinking that podcast was not the way that InsTech London needed to go. Now I'm your very first listener on a Sunday afternoon.
Sunday morning. You've got to get out there early now, Robin. 9 o'clock.
No, I didn't get up. Sunday mornings. No.
I'm afraid there are others who are getting there earlier. And of course, we're doing we shouldn't forget our live chats events that Robin, you and I have been doing. And again, Paolo, to your question, we enjoy doing it. We have great guests. They tolerate Robin and I asking some sort of provocative questions and asking them to explain their acronyms and things. And it seems to work, frankly, given by the volume of people who are listening at a time when everyone's spending their life on video calls and things. It's been great to see all the engagement we've had. So we should wrap up pretty quickly, but Paolo, let me turn to you first of all. What are you seeing coming up in the next 6 to 12 months? Clearly return to work is a major issue for everybody, particularly for organizations like yourself at Brit. But just as we kind of pull this to a close, what do you want to leave people with?
The thought I'll leave people with is that we've been hearing a lot of noise over the past few months from insurtech startups that innovation appears to be slowing up, that incumbents are not engaging with them as much, just at what's the worst possible time for them. And I don't think that it's true that innovation has been slowing up due to COVID. Obviously everything's been disrupted in many ways. But I think what we're seeing, and this was happening already, is that insurers are trying to streamline the number of innovation relationships they have, if that makes sense. And the most insurtechs are still only optimizing a small part of the value chain. And that may be an incredible difference they can make in that small place. But if you're a mid-size insurer, then you really haven't got time to engage with 20, 30, 40, 50 different organizations. You're much more looking to see, is there a smaller number of larger companies who can help you innovate in a number of different places in your organization. And I think that's important for both the large technology providers and also the small insurtech startups to be aware of.
It's a big part of that platform play, which is one of the big themes for us. It has been, but it's going to be particularly important going forward. And Robin, what are you looking out for?
I hate the word, but I'm such a big believer in ecosystems and embedded insurance and this whole line of inquiry that says you've got to make it easier to buy. And in that respect, it's about partnerships and playing nicely in parallel universes and people who have the customers and people who have data about those customers. And I still think we have miles to go there. The legacy tech really holds us back. Everybody kind of knows that they want to change the nature of their engagement model with consumers, but they can't. So I think, that I'd like to see that addressed. And the other issue still is a funding issue in terms of, themes. This is a global problem, but there's so much money to give away to validated successful business. It's still incredibly difficult to get to that point. So as a community, I think we have a role to play there. So that would be a big piece of work, I think, over the next year or two. How do we help people with great ideas get in front of the insurance companies, given that they're streamlining, and how do we help them, get money, given that it's it's a difficult place to be right now. You got your own ideas, Matthew, haven't you? What are you concentrating on?
Yeah, it's sort of pulling those threads together, actually, which is, as with more people we talk to, the more clear it becomes. There's still a big gap out there for some view of what the market is doing by these particular areas, whether it's platforms, prevent and predict, IoT. So we're going to be releasing initially quarterly, but potentially more frequently, slightly more deeper dives into these topics that basically pull together what we're learning from the podcasts, the interviews, the people we talk to, the members, and just become really the go-to place for information around what's out there, and all part of what we're trying to do, which is to separate the noise from the reality, really, and help people find the right partners more quickly. And I think part of that is also, how do these things all connect together? We all know APIs are out there, and it's part of this platforms and ecosystems piece, which is how do you actually, how do you create the plumbing that when you've got the client going in at one end, you've got a loss happening somewhere, and some at the end of the pipe, money gets paid. Now, the technology shouldn't be an inhibitor of that. It should all be seamless to the client and probably even the capital provider. So I think that's one of the other areas we're looking out for, is to start to map out who connects with who and who doesn't. So a lot we can do there. And if anybody's interested in learning more about that or contributing to it, let me know, because we're going to have our first report on parametric insurance coming out in October.
We will really know that we've succeeded in our mission when we no longer hear the word spreadsheet or bordereau. I
don't think spreadsheet's going to die yet. I think that they're going to last for a long time, but hopefully bordereau will disappear. Well, listen, we've come to the top of the hour for our end, and we should bring it to a close there. For anybody listening on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday, we are doing the UK leg of the InsurTech Connect, because they can no longer all go to Vegas and DIA. And we are showcasing 5 great startups, and we are being supported by Anthemis. So you should by now have already seen something from us, but if you haven't, just check us out on the website. It'd be great to have you join us for that. And anybody else who doesn't know or is interested in learning more about InsTech London, then please do drop us a line, hello@instech.london, and we'll see how we get on with this podcast. But hopefully you've enjoyed the 100th episode, and you'll be around for the 200th as well. Thanks, Paolo. Thanks, Robin.
Thanks, pleasure.
Thank you.